In this series, I see the transcendental phenomenological method, the Husserlian method, as the phenomenological method, and I call the first part the reductive-phenomenological method to separate it from the later expansive method. First, reductions are used, and later expansions are used. Hence, I think reductive and expansive are proper terms. As a Husserlian phenomenologist, you always start from the natural attitude. You start from the life world, from the precognitive lived world as it is preconstituted in consciousness. The natural attitude is active in many different moods and feelings. The world is seen differently if you are happy compared to when you are not, as Wittgenstein noted in Culture and Value. You will experience and pay attention to different aspects and possibilities. Your horizons are different. It forms the background to phenomenology. You begin doing phenomenology by leaving the natural attitude. Put differently, you start doing phenomenology when you enter the phenomenological attitude. Thus, the natural attitude can be seen as all attitudes except from the phenomenological one. You must change as a person to enter the phenomenological attitude. You must experience a conversion. Phenomenology is all about that change. You must change in such a way that you will be able to let a phenomenon appear to you, so that you can describe it. Often, the change of attitude happens when you begin to vary a phenomenon within a reflection. If you do this, you know you have changed. It could be difficult to stay in the phenomenological attitude. It's easy to drop back to the default mode, to the natural attitude. You could be close to a phenomenological breakthrough, to finding an essence and expanding from it, but drop back. Furthermore, it's easy to jump ahead to an explanation. If you do, you can start believing in that explanation and stop doing variations. It could sediment a certain view of a certain aspect too early, a view that will hinder a certain appearance. So, try to stay in the phenomenological attitude when you have learned to enter it, or rather, learn to re-enter it over and over again. When you enter the phenomenological attitude, you will also enter an epoché, and at the same time you are doing a reduction. These often happen simultaneously. They are not the same, but happen at the same time. Reduction means leading back. Ductere is to lead in Latin. Aqueducts lead water. The prefix re means back, hence leading back. The reduction leads back to the world, but is put on hold or put on leave. It is not allowed to affect you naturally, so to speak. The reduction also leads back to consciousness. In it, there could be a phenomenon that should be described, and it's not sure that we will return to the same world. Sometimes you may change through the reduction in such a way that the world will not be presented to you in the same way, even though the world itself may be the same. In our case, with the text, the world will change, but this rarely happens. Most times the world is what it is, but our description of it and attitudes to it could change through the different layers found in our reflection. I understand this double leading back as you are not caught up in the world or in consciousness. They are put at some distance. You take a step back from both the world and consciousness. Often it is difficult to do so, but with this method it should be a little easier. Often the epoché and the reduction happens when you start varying something, as I stated before. In your case, concerning the text, it happened, or will happen, right when you start an attempt to doubt the ordinary rectangle text. Maybe you have already started doing that. In such a case, you have entered another attitude. you could already have begun to question the essence or the idea of text. You may already have begun an essential intuition, ein Wesenschau in German. This is done in an eidetic reduction, which often follows the phenomenological one. You could be ideating, you could produce an idea or eidos. The use of the word eidos clarifies that we are within phenomenology. If you actually begin varying or variating, as I often say to make it clear that we are operating within phenomenology, if you began variating the sentence spacing earlier, you started an epoché, a reduction and an intuition, and you did it by a variation. If you have not started to question the text yet, you are still in the natural attitude. You are still stuck in your old life world and have not begun an attempt to doubt the text. I'm trying to get you to do that. I'm trying to push you into a phenomenological attitude. So, stop resisting. As you may understand, you need not know about phenomenology to vary something and produce ideas. It happens in ordinary life. You attempt to doubt something and then you will do something to leave that doubt. In phenomenology, this procedure is much more formalized and it should be attended to rigorously. As I stated before, the further step in a phenomenological reduction is called essential intuition, or eidetic reduction. Sometimes the term ideation is used for this step when you will reach an invariance, but ideation can also be understood as a method within the eidetic reduction. That is why I am separating essential intuition and ideation. In my view, ideation is when you put something into words within a variation. I will give you an example concerning sentence spacing. You could produce variations and think of the sentence spacing as a space consisting of, for example, 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9 spaces. You could then ideate them, i.e. use ideation, and call such spaces a 3-space spacing, a 5-space spacing, and so on. Putting names on possible aspects could be seen as ideations. You can also name essences by ideations. Concerning the phenomenological and eidetic reduction of text, this process of variation and ideation could and should be repeated for all aspects of a text. Margins, letters, different spaces, and so on. Everything should be doubted and made explicit. It should be variated and ideated, if possible. In this, you should also describe essences. I will just give one such example right now. We are putting our thumbs in the outer margins. The outer margin is a thumb space, a space for our thumbs. It's trivial, it happens all the time, it's evident, it's apodictic. It's making an experience possible. Hence, it's an essence. Now we can begin to variate and ideate it further. We can begin to try to expand it properly. Should it be half an inch or an inch wide, some other size? I will clarify this later. Later, I will give a much lengthier description concerning text. Now I just want to give you examples to describe steps within the phenomenological method. You need to keep these two objectives apart, which you will do with your intentionality. You can focus either on the aspects concerning phenomenology or the aspects concerning the text, and you have to change between them to understand both. At first, all this concerning essences happens in our stream of consciousness. But as you understand, we must also experience some aspects, and we must do it in an appropriate way. We cannot always make a description only by the use of our mind. I mean, we could, but it could be better made after certain experiences. This can be seen as we are leaving and re-entering the phenomenological reduction. We are leaving and entering reflective consciousness. In the phenomenological process, we are not subjects experiencing an object. We are not actually looking at a text or reading it. That happens before our reflection, before our turn to consciousness. It's the experience primordial to our phenomenological reflection. In the phenomenological attitude, we are experiencing the text in our mind's eye. Things happen in our stream of consciousness. We will imagine an aspect of a text before we will create it. If we are writing a text, we are variating and ideating it outside consciousness. We could do that, but often it will be a process that first happens in our mind. When we read, we cannot reflect upon the process of the text, and in a reflection, we cannot read. In phenomenology, we must always manage this gap. Often we need to go back and forth. The corresponding subject-object relation, or mind-thing relation, in consciousness, Husserl termed noema and noesis. The names make it explicit that we are operating within phenomenology, so that we know we are intending these objects in consciousness with a phenomenological attitude. It's a distinction made for precision. The noema is the phenomenon in consciousness corresponding to the real object, or correlated with the object. The noema is leading back to the object, in our case, the text. The real object is an actual text, and the corresponding conscious object is the noema. The noesis is the process producing or managing the noema. It is the activity that constitutes the noema. It's the subjectivity or thinking at work, so to speak. This process, in consciousness, when the noema and the noesis changes, is potentially both subject and object producing. A noesis is the process that presents the noema to us. It is the process that is making noema given to us. Common examples are the differences between the loving and the what is loved, and the hating and what is hated. It could be seen as if the noesis is a verb and the noema a noun. An easy way to understand the noema is as that which is left when you have seen something from many different angles. For example, a house. You cannot see all its sides at once, but you can see it in many times from different angles. Only profiles can be given to perception and thus to consciousness. And when all such are assembled, through the noesis, a noema is produced. It is the corresponding house in consciousness. It is the house that the consciousness presents to itself. We must experience the different aspects of a text and assemble them as a whole. But we cannot focus on all aspects at once. We must go through them one at a time, and then they could change the noema. If the noema changes in our mind, we could produce another real object, a real text. Concerning text, we can see the different aspects of a text as profiles. We can pay attention to them one at a time, but not all at once. But the text is always given as a whole. With noemas and noesis, we are residing within static phenomenology, in which we can do noematic and noetic analysis. For example, a text can be intended, and we can intend in different wholes and parts concerning the text, i.e., different profiles, and also different noematic and noetic moves that will change both the noema and the noetic action. If we change a text, it could be differently intended. The noetic action changes, which in turn changes the noema. They change mutually. Besides static phenomenology, there is also genetic and generative phenomenology. As I see it, we can add time to static phenomenology and then we get genetic phenomenology. The process in which a phenomenon will appear is often layered or sedimented. and you can try to articulate the meaning constitution and the layers in the process. For instance, the cluster text didn't appear to me in a certain moment. We may need to see something under a certain aspect at a certain point in the process, which will change how we can see the following aspects. This process can be shown through a genetic description. You can do this concerning the process in which the cluster text appears to you. Generative phenomenology concerns historic phenomena. It's applicable to cultural objects such as texts. Our texts have been looking much the same since the 10th century. Look at the Exto book. It looks much like our books. It's from 970 CE. This kind of text became obvious and natural to the medieval mind, and it has stayed so throughout history. Until now, possibly. This text could be seen as what the natural attitude will produce. It produced a set of beautifully arranged rectangles. I will give a description of this text later. It has its own noema, which is produced by its noesis. It can be described through how it's intended by our intentionality. We will reach the noema and its noesis through an intentional analysis. The intentional analysis can be understood as the phenomenological method. It is what you do when you are doing phenomenology. Husserlian phenomenology, that is. That is how we will be able to reach essences and let the phenomenon appear. This will be easier to understand later through the text example. Now, I can say that it's different to describe how objects are intended in the natural attitude, which can be understood as descriptive psychology, and to describe an intended noema through variations and ideations in consciousness, which can be understood as if we are doing phenomenology. In all this, we must pay close attention to our stream of consciousness, but it is also important not to forget our body. Through perception, objects are given to us. They are made possible to us through our body. Our body can be seen as a phenomenal body. It has layers of meaning. It is already loaded with meaning. We could describe its presence or absence concerning phenomena. For example, in texts. The text phenomenon should be intuited in relation to our body. As we are paying close attention to our stream of consciousness, we should see what it does, what it produces, and describe its essential features and structures. It could be our bodily structures, or not. Before I mentioned the thumbs in the outer margin. That is but one such thing that could be noted. It would have been quite weird to intuit a text without taking account of our body. We are holding a text, touching the paper, smelling the paper, turning the pages, moving our thumbs, writing on it, letting our eyes wander over it, or letting our eyes follow the words on the page. Our body is quite active, as the text is intended in different ways through it. We can also browse for a certain page number, look for a reference, and so on. What we also must do is to proceed from an essence to its corresponding existence. We could see the outer margin as thumb space, that's its essence, but we must also put it into existence appropriately. Otherwise, we may not come closer to the thing itself. For example, it could be appropriate with an outer margin that is 1 inch. If we turn an essence into its appropriate existence, it could sometimes make us pay attention to another essence that we couldn't see before. Moreover, we must also find our way back to the life world when we have reached a full phenomenon. We must return to the natural attitude. In the natural attitude, with a small thumb space, we may need to move our thumbs hundreds of times when we are reading a book. It will affect our natural attitude, which will affect the phenomenon. At first we are taking interest in the life of the mind, and then we must take an interest in the life in the world. We may need to zigzag or way forward between those attitudes to give a full description of a phenomenon. In phenomenology, we are interested in phenomena, in objects or aspects as they are given to consciousness. And just to make it clear, objects could mean anything, a mathematical formula, a feeling, or an ordinary object as a table or a text. It doesn't matter whether it's real, imagined, or a remembered object. It is still a phenomenon given to consciousness, and as such it can be described. In such descriptions we may see patterns, and they can be understood as the structure of consciousness that produces the phenomenon. For some phenomena, such as triangles, it is indifferent whether we are experiencing or imagining them. They will still have the same properties. We will be able to describe the same essences. This is not always the case. It's not the same to imagine an angry barking dog as experiencing it, especially if you are afraid of dogs. This is an important issue in phenomenology. It's about the difference between essences and existences. Often, Husserl was more essentialist. Later, many became more existentialist. I call the existential tradition the phenomenotical tradition. It is more practical and anthropological, more existential. You could say that they reverse the order of essence and existence, of essence and experience. As they see it, you can only make a proper description by starting from and ending with the existence of something. They also stopped using and describing the Husserlian method. They stopped intuiting essences and instead they described experiences. All that really mattered to them was concrete existences. As I see it, you will often take too many things for granted in such an approach, such as rectangle texts. Concerning the text phenomenon, this tension between essences and existences will be felt quite hard. As I see it, both strategies must be used. In my opinion, we must first turn to Husserl and make use of what he provided. But there are also cases where we must turn to experience. But even so, I mean that we must try to do it in a Husserlian fashion, meaning that we must use ideation and variation also concerning the existences, i.e. concerning the expansion of the essences. Now I have made a quick recap of phenomenology. You can see it as a reminder. I tried to connect it loosely to the text phenomenon, and by doing so I hope you grasp phenomenology a little better. The first time you listen to this it could be difficult, but I think it will be much easier the second time. Later, when you have experienced a proper phenomenological description, it will be easier to understand this recap. Now I will also give you some general thoughts on phenomenology. They could be put to good use when you are doing phenomenology. It's good to know some things to get appropriately active. First, as I have stated before, you are always a beginner, i.e. you must always try to see phenomena anew. You must learn to see, as it is sometimes stated. This is easy to understand concerning the text phenomenon. Any phenomenologist could have intended the text with a phenomenological attitude, but they didn't. They couldn't, for some reason, and it could be important to learn why to avoid it in the future. Now we must see the text anew, i.e. as beginners. It's easy to relapse into the ordinary ways of thinking. It's easy to get egocentric, as within philosophy, and it's easy to get object-centric, as within science. In phenomenology, we should try to move beyond them. Phenomenology is not a mere subjectivism or objectivism, nor a mere rationalism or empiricism, and neither a mere idealism or realism. Often, it tries to go beyond all these perspectives. This is not easy to grasp. In a sense, Husserl appreciated all these traditions but tried to move beyond them, and so should we. Concerning subjectivism and objectivism, we can use the cluster text as an example. We can see it as if we are changing both the object and ourselves, the subject. We are turning the object into a cluster text and ourselves into cluster text readers. Both subjectivity and objectivity change mutually. They are related and change at the same time. With an approach that is too subjectivist, we will only describe the subject, and with an approach that is too objectivist, we will only describe the object. If you start from the phenomenon, i.e. the manifest subject-object relation, we could describe both the subject and the object through each other. And then we could be said to have moved beyond both subjectivity and objectivity, beyond both the subject and the object. This is an important lesson. Often we could try to explain how subjectivism and objectivism have encountered something, and then it could be easier to move beyond them in a phenomenological fashion. Concerning empiricism and rationalism, we can turn to Immanuel Kant. He stated that experience without theory is blind, and that theory without experience is mere intellectual play. Even if we use reasoning and experience, even if we think and experiment, we could go wrong. In phenomenology, we are trying to think rigorously to do proper experiences, and thus move beyond empiricism and rationalism. They are often too egocentric, too subjectivist, and too objectivist. As for objectivism and subjectivism, we could also try to describe how empiricists and rationalists would have approached something to try to move beyond them. This could be seen as a general phenomenological approach. This also holds for realism and idealism. In phenomenology, we are trying to use a kind of idealism to become more realist. We are trying to get to the heart of the real world through transcendental consciousness. From within phenomenology, all these traditions and perspectives are often described in such a way that a small change in them improves the phenomenological outlook. We should not become too naively subjectivist or objectivist, too rationalist or empiricist, nor too realist or idealist. There is a fine balance to consider. In fact, a great thing about phenomenology, I find, is that it makes all the other philosophical views much more interesting. If you like to read about the history of philosophy, you can start by learning phenomenology and then go on reading your way through the history of philosophy to see the contrasts. It could be a good way to start learning philosophy. It could also improve your view of phenomenology. Within the different perspectives, you will end up in different places that will affect your thoughts in certain ways. Some are beneficial, others are not. Many misinterpret phenomenology starting from the natural attitude or some of the perspectives I have mentioned. It can sound like this. If something, phenomenology is nothing but a new Platonism, nothing but a new Cartesianism, nothing but a new method of introspection. It's just a new kind of whatever. If you misinterpret it, it will not appear properly to you, and then you will direct your interest elsewhere. By this presentation, I hope that this will not happen. I hope you are doing phenomenology along with me, and that it will cause phenomenology to appear to you in a more fruitful way. I hope you will also recognize that it is better to see phenomenology from within it than from the natural attitude or some other perspective. To do phenomenology could be seen as prep work or groundwork. We are preparing for a following empirical step. We are preparing for certain experiences. We are preparing for science and the scientists. It could be seen the same way as artists are prepared for. To paint a ceiling al fresco, you must prepare it properly. The surface must be of the right materials, put on at the right time. The colors must be properly blended, the proper tools should be made available. Scaffolding should be erected, and so on. As phenomenologists, we must do all that concerning a certain phenomenon. In this presentation, we're trying to do it for texts. We must put everything in order before we let writers and authors use it to create their magic, and before we let scientists explain it. Now I hope you have understood that an attitude of carefulness and rigorousness is needed. And since they are needed, perseverance is also needed. It could be exhausting to try to be careful and rigorous. In phenomenology, we also need responsibility and honesty. Husserl developed his views before the Great Wars. He took honesty and responsibility very seriously, especially self-responsibility. But soon, irrationalism took over. To rehabilitate phenomenology, we need to return to its rationalist roots. We need to become more honest and responsible. In our case, we should try to become more responsible concerning texts. Before we continue, I should also present the phenomenotical fork that developed from phenomenology. As it turned out, Husserl became a leader with almost no followers. Eugène Fink can be seen as a follower. He refused to take a position at university during the Nazi era. He displayed carefulness, honesty, and responsibility when many others got more irrational. In the 1900s, almost the whole world turned irrationalist. Few, almost nobody, took Husserl's ideas to their hearts. Even Husserl described himself as a leader without followers. Rationalism and sober thinking were not in vogue. Some took an idea and expanded from it, but rarely more. The prime example being Heidegger, of course. He turned into such a disappointment. Calling Heidegger a phenomenologist and seeing his thought as phenomenological may not be very beneficial. It could create a lot of misunderstanding and confusion. If something is too different, you should call it something else, and that is why I'm referring to him as a phenomenotician, and that he is doing a kind of phenomenotics in another spirit than the Husserlian one. In the so-called phenomenological tradition or movement, which I call the phenomenotical movement, many cherry picks both from Husserl, Heidegger, and later many others. I mean that we should start by using a proper Husserlian phenomenology, and then we can decide to turn to the phenomenoticians. I hope my handling of the text will exemplify my view in a good way. Later, many only took the idea to the things themselves and developed their own thoughts. They didn't develop careful methods. In a way, they just wrote what they wanted and called it phenomenology. If it was a description, it could be said to be phenomenology. Few saw phenomenology as rigorous science. The phenomenoticial spirit is quite different from Husserl's. Heidegger had an ambiguous influence. He derailed phenomenology and then he left it. We have to go back and rehabilitate phenomenology from that point. This is easier if we see Heidegger as the first phenomenotician. This does not mean that Heidegger is always wrong. He can certainly be rewarding. It's just that he is not doing phenomenology in the Husserlian sense. It just means that we could see him as belonging to another tradition. Heidegger discarded the intentional analysis and the reductions. He turned phenomenology into phenomenological hermeneutics, and hence phenomenotics could be seen as a proper term. But he still maintained that he was going to the things themselves. He probably even meant that he did it better than Husserl. He was not true to Husserl, but to the things themselves, and he probably saw himself as the true phenomenologist, as did others. The Heideggerian Phenomenotics is a return to the things themselves as ordinary, everyday objects used by the humans that are experiencing them existentially. To turn to them should unveil the meaning of being. The experience of everyday objects are seen as being primordial to other ways of experiencing other objects. Heidegger's main interest was the question of being. He wanted to do fundamental ontology, not Husserlian phenomenology. As for Husserl, Heidegger's description concerns that which comes before theory. but he is not interested in the structure of consciousness. That is seen as too Cartesian. Instead, in a sense, he is more realist, more objectivist. He wanted to describe the structure of existence. He described existences or existentials instead of essences. In this world, in being, the subject is turned into Dasein. The subject-object model is seen as too Cartesian and must be overcome. There is a more fundamental condition to explore before we can adopt the Cartesian subject-object model. Dasein can be understood as their being. It's a human being, a being there in time and in the world among others. Dasein is a being in the world, a being in time, and a being with others. Dasein is situated historically in a world among other people. According to Heidegger, that must always be our starting point. The things themselves are given in a world, in time, among other people. That is a condition for being, for thinking about being. Consciousness is not pure, it's in a body, in the world, in time, among other people. And the Dasein must experience all this as a throwness into the present situation and relate to it and itself. The Dasein must interpret its own situation. Thus, hermeneutics is a basic condition and an existential for Dasein, in being. It's fundamental. This means that things could be given to consciousness differently at different times in different cultures, in a different world among different people, so to speak. I have no problem with this description. I can even see it as somewhat phenomenological, prefer to call it phenomenotical. I think parts of being and time are illuminating. As I see it, Heidegger starts from the object pole, whereas Husserl starts from the subject pole. Heidegger is trying to be more objectivist than Husserl. Heidegger said that he thought Husserl was too subjectivist, too Cartesian. Every other object or being may need a different method to appear as a proper phenomenon. Any method that unveils the object should be used, and the Husserlian method may not always do that, according to Heidegger. Possibly we should even say that it cannot do that, according to Heidegger, since he did not use that method. If he thought it could, he would probably have used it. In short, Heidegger is a great reductive thinker, but a terrible expansive thinker. As he goes on to describe the human condition as a being towards death, causing dread, and that we should choose a hero to manage our situation, he derailed phenomenology. When he introduced his political thoughts close to his phenomenology, he became a lost cause. Heidegger used his thinking to become a Nazi. He started from his existentials and expanded into a Nazi. His hermeneutics, his way of interpreting the things themselves, meant that he wanted all phenomena to appear within a Nazi environment. Students were infatuated with Heidegger in the 1910s and 1920s. He was an inspiring lecturer and held seminars rather than lectures. He inspired his students to question things. Contrary to Heidegger, Husserl was boring and held monologues. He was probably seen as old and outdated. Heidegger was the new thing that could lead his students into the future. The students felt that it was Heidegger who could lead them to the promised land, not Husserl. I am quite bothered by Heidegger. He is not without merit, certainly not, but to talk of him as a great philosopher doesn't sit well with me. We cannot see philosophers as we see artists. We should hold them to a higher standard. You need not be a saint, but neither should you turn into a devil, so to speak. We can possibly judge artists only through their artworks, but we should not release philosophers from parts of their thinking, from their philosophies of life, so to speak. I see Heidegger more as a one-hit wonder. He managed to write an inspiring book, but he also got lost. Concerning many things he was as wrong as you can ever be. So I think we should stop talking about him as a great philosopher. We should not continue that discourse. We will probably only discredit ourselves by doing it. And it's probably better to see him as a great semi-philosopher or semi-great philosopher. I will just give one example of his many failings. In Sweden, in the beginning of the 1900s, 1 million peasants worked in the fields to produce food for 5 million people. 100 years later, with the help of machines, only about 10,000 are needed to provide for 10 million. Many have been able to leave the toil on the fields. Heidegger saw this as a problem and complained about technology. But still, people think of him as a great philosopher. He even equated the gas chambers in the Holocaust and the agricultural machines as he saw them as belonging to the same problematic technological hegemony. This is actually quite enigmatic, as he himself had a weak body. He probably didn't work with his body very much, possibly almost not at all. The list goes on with such examples, so it's better to see him as a semi-great philosopher. A great reductionist but a terrible expansionist. A good destructionist but terrible constructionist. In some ways, Heidegger is almost an unthinker, not careful at all. He probably wanted to be seen as a deep thinker, and some still see him as that. You have to apply your thinking and decide how you want to see him. When you have understood and used Husserlian phenomenology, you may not see Heidegger's version as that great. Because of Heidegger, many didn't develop the Husserlian thoughts about philosophy and phenomenology. Many took like 90% from Heidegger and 10% from Husserl. It would probably be better the other way around, and that is why the phenomenological tradition needs rehabilitation. I see Phenomenotics in a few different ways. In his later thinking, Husserl developed thoughts about the life world and lived experiences. They can also be seen as somewhat phenomenotical. Phenomenology is about essences and their relation to phenomena. Phenomenotics is about existences and their relation to phenomena. It can be seen as the practical and existential fork of phenomenology. I think it is important to begin doing phenomenology, and then we can proceed by doing Phenomenotics. We should not skip the phenomenological step. We should not skip the Epoché and the reductions. If we do, we may end up becoming mere phenomenoticians. If we start from essences, I prefer to call the expansion expansive phenomenology instead of Phenomenotics, even if it's more practical and existential. In this, phenomenology can be seen as reductive and Phenomenotics as expansive. In phenomenology, we may need to peel off some layers to reach a pure phenomenon, or pure subjectivity, relatively. And in Phenomenotics, we need to add them. This later step will be different depending on the first step. Concerning the text, we will peel layers from the rectangle text to turn it into a cluster text, and then the layers we must add will be different. We need to interpret them differently, first with an expansive phenomenology and then, possibly, with a Phenomenotics. When we are leaving the natural attitude, we will enter the phenomenological one. When we are finished, we must find our way back to the natural attitude. To do that can also be seen as a phenomenutical attitude. We are trying to expand our way back to the natural attitude. As we do that, we may need to reinterpret many things, events, etc. We must use a hermeneutics, which I call Phenomenotics, which is meant to show that it is done close to phenomenology. Within this difference, phenomenology can be seen as more transcendental. It's about the life of the mind. It's about the conditions for something to be able to appear. It's about a questioning back to origins. Phenomenology is thus, in a sense, more theoretical, more cognitive. Phenomenotics is more practical, more experiential, more non-cognitive. It's about life in the world. Occasionally, I use this speech about phenomenotics and the phenomenotical attitude a bit pejoratively. When you're not as rigorous and careful, when you're using a sloppy phenomenology, you can be seen as a mere phenomenotician. When you have not shown that you have tried to use your thinking exhaustively, you could be seen as a mere phenomenotician. Many qualitative studies, purporting to be phenomenological, I see as mere phenomenotical. Researchers can sometimes become a bit too naive, a bit too naturalist, too psychologistic, i.e., they take too many things for granted, especially if they have not properly phenomenologized different concepts or objects prior to their studies. This should be clear through the text example. It's an object present and important in many areas, but it did not get phenomenologized before other studies were made. This is loosely what I mean with the phenomeноtical attitude. It's practical and more naively realist. You turn to practices without contemplating the parts in them properly. You're accepting the present existences whether they are the result of proper essences or not. What you are seeing should possibly not be seen at all, as with many events related to text. To be even clearer, I'm not sure it's very honest to say that you are doing phenomenology when you're acting in such a way. You can even be seen as if you're only parasitizing on phenomenology. Now I have expressed a few positions concerning Phenomenotics. It's probably still a bit unclear, but I hope you get the gist of it. I think you will understand the so-called phenomenological tradition better through this distinction. At this point, I should make it clear that both strategies could be used. Sometimes you need to become more phenomeноtical when you have been phenomenological. Sometimes they must be used interchangeably, as with the cluster text. We cannot get close to the text phenomenon, to the text itself, without actually experiencing its parts properly. We must think phenomenologically and we must act phenomenotically to get to the text itself, so to speak. This will be clearer ahead, but as you probably already understand, we cannot reach an ideal text in our head. We need to fill the phenomenon with certain experiences. The rehabilitation of the phenomenological tradition could proceed in such a way that some things are kept within it, but others are deferred and seen as belonging to the phenomenological fork. For example, we could possibly use some thoughts from Heidegger, but defer most of them to the phenomenological tradition. In this, we need to dissect what we can keep. This is easier if we actually have experienced Husserlian phenomenology, if we have done or experienced a proper phenomenological reduction and its description. Still, we shouldn't be entirely dismissive of the phenomenological fork. We need to proceed from pure phenomenon to a full phenomenon, and then we can learn from the phenomenoticians that are dealing with practical matters, with existence. For example, we can learn from the existentialists. It could also be interesting to see what it means for a thing, as the cluster text, to be experienced in different moods, in a being towards death, in an Arendtian project, a Levinasian enjoyment, or in a certain perceptual or moral environment, just to mention a few possibilities. I think this distinction between phenomenology and phenomeноtic is quite useful when you turn to the development after Husserl. It's quite challenging to interpret the thinkers after Husserl. You need to become somewhat of a hunter and gatherer. I will give an example. As a whole, Jean-Paul Sartre's so-called phenomenology, or ontology, is not of much use. But in his books there are bits and pieces that can be used. He gave some wonderful and important descriptions. This is true of many in the French tradition. As a whole, Emmanuel Levinas may not be of much use, but his thought about meeting the other as a face can be used as inspiration. What I hope is that 80% of Husserl will be used and that we then could complement his basic phenomenology with thoughts from other thinkers. I think that will make us productive in a responsible and honest manner. I hope that my description of Husserlian phenomenology by my text example will help you to better assess the development of the Husserl. If you actually have made and lived through an essential intuition and the Husserlian phenomenological description, it should be harder to dismiss Husserl. I think most have tried to think their way through his method without using it, and that is why they failed. That is probably also why they were led astray, mostly by Heidegger, but also by other philosophers. This approach can be applied to the whole of continental philosophy. For instance, we can turn to Jacques Derrida in the same way. He misinterpreted certain aspects in Husserl's phenomenology to develop what now often is commonly referred to as deconstruction. There is much in Derrida's work that probably is not of much use, but there are also bits and pieces that can be used. His critique of a stable structure of meaning can be understood through the text example. If we are to replace rectangle texts, it will take quite some time until meaning is stable again. Every rectangle text reader must be replaced with a cluster text reader to make meaning more stable. And this is just but one phenomenon that is creating a havoc of meaning. If you add phenomena, it will be even more problematic. It's not very smart to dismiss the whole postmodern strain of thinking, as some do. There are clarifying thoughts also within that tradition. There are also interesting connections between phenomenology and analytic philosophy. There are bridge builders between Husserl and the analytic tradition. Dagfinn Føllesdal is but one example. Kurt Gödel was another who was interested in Husserl's phenomenology. Phenomenology can be seen as pre-analytic. It could be seen as a tool to produce the original propositions that later can be evaluated with tools from analytic philosophy. They can also be seen as sharing the same piecemeal approach. I am analyzing the text in such a way. It's a piece that must be properly managed, phenomenologized and analyzed, and then we can turn to another piece. What we are doing now can be seen as a phenomenology of phenomenology, or as a phenomenology of the so-called phenomenological tradition. Before we can do phenomenology, it must appear to us. We cannot use something that is not part of our thinking. We must decide what thoughts to expand from. We must reduce the tradition to be able to expand from it in an appropriate manner. In this, I will expand from Husserlian phenomenology. The way you intend the so-called phenomenological tradition will affect how phenomenology will appear to you, and thus how you can expand through it. We could use the phenomenological tools of ideation and variation on phenomenology itself. If we do, it is easy to see the essence or invariance as the turn to the things themselves. That is what everyone is saying they are doing. Thus, much is phenomenology. But if we assess the different ways of expanding from that essence, we should probably ideate them differently. We should name them differently if they are too different from each other. That is why I suggest that the ending ology should apply when you are rigorous and careful, both in reductions and expansions, and the ending otics when you are not as rigorous. If we do that, it will be easier to orient ourselves within the traditions, and hopefully we will not make as many mistakes and get derailed. I hope that my example with the text can show the much needed rehabilitation, i.e. that we need to return to Husserl. What I am actually trying to do right now is to pull you from the natural attitude, and at the same time I am trying to push you into the phenomenological one. I'm trying to do this in a few different ways. I'm trying to enable you to make certain distinctions. I'm trying to get you to see what phenomenology could be and what it is not. Later, I will try to make you engage with the text phenomenologically. I'm preparing you for a certain kind of experience, a phenomenological experience. I'm trying to describe the essences that will make you experience a certain experience. The first time, it is difficult to do phenomenology all on your own. It's difficult to get into the phenomenological attitude and to use the phenomenological method. This lecture series can be seen as a tool to do that for the first time, and then I hope you can continue doing it on your own. If you're about to accept, for now, what I have said so far, I hope you will be able to understand a lot about phenomenology. If you're about to do that, you could hopefully go to the things themselves, and in our case, to the text itself. The famous words, to the things themselves, Husserl wrote in the second paragraph in his Logical Investigations 2. We want to go back to the things themselves. Wir wollen auf die Sachen selbst zurückgehen. In Ideas 1, paragraph 20, he wrote another famous quote, that it is the phenomenologists who are the genuine positivists. If, by positivism, we are to mean the absolute unbiased grounding of all science on what is positive, i.e. on what can be primordially apprehended, then it is we who are the genuine positivists. By paraphrasing it, we can now state that it is we, the Husserlians, who are the genuine phenomenologists, and that the others are mere phenomenoticians. In Husserl's book Crisis, disappointed that almost nobody followed him, Husserl stated that the dream was over. If we succeed in rehabilitating phenomenology, we could continue and pursue Husserl's dream, beginning with the text itself. If we could stay rigorous, careful, responsible, and honest, and not get derailed, the dream may not be over. Der Traum ist nicht ausgeträumt. We can show this through the text, and hope that others also will start following Husserl. Now I hope I have prepared you for a full turn to the text. We will turn to the text in the next lecture, and we will do it by following Husserl.